Today is Friday, June 7th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. When we look at the Gospels, I always find one of the most interesting teachings to be that of the parable of the prodigal son. In the parable of the prodigal son, we learn of a father who has two sons. One of them is relatively good, the other seems to be evil. The evil son chooses to leave his father's home and chooses to go out into the world to pursue his own pleasure. The good son stays home and continues to work with his father. You would imagine if someone took a snapshot of that father's life, they would say that he raised one good son and one bad son. But the story goes on, and we learn that though that bad son had gone away, he had good thoughts. As he pursued pleasure, he was disappointed. And he learned the same lesson that his father likely taught him, namely, that the way of sinners is hard, as the Old Testament teaches, and that the reason why we should seek virtue, why we should live according to God's will, is not simply so we can avoid going to hell, but so that we can actually be happy presently. I'm sure that the son was taught that message again and again by his father. And if he wasn't taught that message, if his father actually allowed him to live sinfully at home, there would have been no reason to leave. He left to get away from the moral restrictions of his family. And as I said, he learned the hard way that the way of sinners is hard, that the pursuit of inordinate pleasure is not a source of happiness, but of misery. And he was a young man who needed to learn that by his own experience. And as he went on in that pursuit, day by day, we can imagine the experiences multiplying that confirmed what he was taught at home. So even though he was doing bad things, he was learning the truth. The truth was being confirmed in him and to him in a way that it could never have been confirmed by his father's teaching alone. The son who stayed at home, as I said, appeared to be a good son. And we can imagine that the father was pleased with the good son and grieved by the son who left. And as I said, if we took a snapshot of that father's life at that point, he would be quite unhappy knowing that his son was lost in the world. Working through the day, wondering what his son's situation was, trying to go to bed at night, thinking about whether his son might be suffering some evil. For a loving parent, there can be no rest while a child is away, morally speaking. And the father had to live with that nagging concern for his son. But then, later on, the son finally learns his lesson. He gets to a point where he's suffered all that he could stand. And he became persuaded, surely by necessity, that the way of sin was not only hard, it was impossible. And he finally comes to the end when he runs out of money. And sustainability is always the problem of pleasure seeking. Again, the way of virtue is sustainable. It's happy. It's good. It's productive. It's positive. But the way of vice is unsustainable. And eventually, a vicious person ends up with nothing. And this son had reached that point. So his situation appears to have gone from bad to worse, but if we really think about it, it went from worse to better. Because losing his money, his ability to pursue pleasure, finally ran out. And he was forced to choose one of two options. And some may dismiss this and say, oh, well, he had no choice. He had no choice but to return. And that's false. The choice to return was not his only option. He had a number of options, one of which was to kill himself. He could have killed himself. He was probably tempted to kill himself because he had squandered his entire inheritance. He'd lost everything. He had no friends. He blew it. And there would be no way for him to ever recover what he had lost. He could have killed himself. That would have been the worst situation. That was his father's fear. His father's fear is that this son would go from bad to worse and finally destroy himself. And I'm sure that the father prayed and made offerings to God for that son, as Job did for his children, that God might give his son grace and lead him to repentance. And the father knew nothing about that son until the day when he saw him walking up to the house. And the scene is one of the most moving and beautiful scenes anywhere in literature, not just in scripture. And we see the father's response. He runs to his son. Jesus teaches that he threw his arms around him and kissed him. And we can understand that because that father was constantly thinking about that son. Constantly worried about him going from bad to worse, and all of a sudden, unexpectedly, the father realized that a result he may never have expected had come to pass. The best situation. And the father says, "My son was dead and is alive again." Just a beautiful passage. Beautiful image. One of the most important in all of sacred scripture. My son was dead. Yeah, if you would have taken a snapshot before that day, for all intents and purposes, that father was father of a son who had died, at least with respect to him and their relationship. And yet on this day, the situation had not just changed from worse to better, but from worst to best. He didn't just receive some good news about his son. His son actually came home. And the father rejoices, calls for his servants to go and prepare a feast. They're going to celebrate. And then Jesus tells us of the other son, and we can imagine the other son's reaction, and it's reasonable. The other son can't think of his brother the way the father thinks of his son. The brother was surely injured in many ways by the brother who left. Financially, the brother took half the inheritance, but the household also lost the brother's help. And the brother who remained had to bear the burden of what was essentially a lost brother. And so you can imagine all the days when that brother, the brother who stayed home, had to work extra, had to do more, had to cancel plans, had to miss opportunities for his own pleasure, lawful and good pleasure, because of the consequences of his brother's life. We could even imagine that he lost some respect in the community because of this shameful story of his brother, this prodigal. The other brothers suffered in a number of different ways because of his lost brother. And all of a sudden here, that brother comes home, and we can imagine that the brother, assuming he's decent, would have been happy to see him. Maybe not. Some people are so obnoxious in their sin that while we would never wish them to actually be dead, at the same time, we feel relieved to have their bad influence go away. We can imagine that the brother would likely feel happy to see his brother return, but surprised at his father's response. What the heck? The father calls for a feast. Like this is some noble son returning from war, defending his country, bringing honor to his family. The father's reaction is comparable to what his reaction would be if a heroic son was returning. And so it's obvious that the father's reaction is strange. And the son who stayed home says, what the heck? Here I am, sticking around at home, picking up the slack from this loser who goes off and blows everything on a sinful, foolish life. I sit here doing extra work, bearing with the consequences of his sinful life. And now he comes home and it's time to celebrate? Now that's too much. That's not just. And he's angry at his father's response. And so now, if we were to take a snapshot of the father's life at this point, we have a different picture. We've got the father rejoicing, happy, with his train wreck of a son standing on one side, miserable. I mean, he's lost everything. He's coming home asking if he can just work as a servant. He's not even expecting to be received when he comes home. And now the other son is also miserable because he's frustrated that his father is celebrating the return of this bum. What a different snapshot. Happy father, two miserable sons. The father then goes on to talk to his previously good son and say, look, I understand what you're thinking, I understand how you feel, and you're right. But you have to understand that your brother, to me, was lost, like a son who had died, and he's been found again. He's alive. And the father encourages the other son to rejoice with him and celebrate, because the situation of the whole family is good. And we see in this other brother the vice of envy. He's angry to see his brother receiving good things. He believes his brother deserves bad things, and he's right. But then in the end, we can imagine that the repentant brother is probably overwhelmed by his father's response. And Jesus says that he who is forgiven much loves much. And that relationship between that son, the prodigal son, and his father would have to change to some degree. Sometimes it takes repeated lessons, repeated experiences of that kind of love to really believe that that love is real. But being forgiven much, he probably looked at his father differently that day. And the other son as well, seeing his father's forgiveness, surely looked at his father differently and said, wow, well, I think Dad's a little nuts. He's very forgiving. That's certainly a virtue. And so we can imagine the father and his sons getting together for that feast, celebrating, realizing that everything is well again. And we can imagine someone taking a snapshot at that moment, and we have yet another picture, very different from the previous pictures. And what I find interesting about the parable is our Lord presents that story as normal life. He presents it as normal. He tells that story focusing actually on the father and says, yeah, that's how God acts when a sinner repents. This is normal. This is normal life. There's good times, there's terrible times, there's fallen away children, lost sons, envious sons, restored sons, repentant sons, joyful times. And as long as the end is joyful, what happens along the way really doesn't matter. And so the father could have taken those old snapshots and tore them up and said, that's not our family. And he could have taken the snapshot taken at the feast and said, there, that's our family. That's me and my 2 sons. That's our family picture. As long as everything ends well, the process doesn't matter. The difficulties and the sufferings, the losses, even great financial losses, don't matter if our hearts are right. As long as the end is joyful, we will never care of what was lost. All's well that ends well. And as I said, Jesus teaches us that this is normal. That's how life works. It's how salvation works. That's how God thinks of and deals with men. It's normal. Now, when we come to Christian parenting, many Christian parents are terrified by the people in their lives who are taking snapshots at random times. They're terrified of the snapshots. They start their families, they have children, and they're obsessed with thoughts about what others see. They're obsessed with that thought of snapshots being taken throughout their family life. And so they're trying always to look good for the camera, as it were. They want every snapshot to appear to be good. We see this on social media. They want every snapshot to be happy, beautiful, rejoicing, together, and so on. Every picture has to be happy and beautiful and impressive. And this is usually temporary and unsustainable, shallow, pretended. And the parents are usually pretty good at continuing to look good for the camera, especially when the children are all young. But then as the children get older, we see reality start to kick in. Human nature begins to manifest itself, and the children move from the phase of life where they're young and dependent and weak and pretty easy to control, to the point where in their teens they begin to develop a sense of independence. They start to sniff the freedom of adulthood, and they realize that they really don't need to listen to their parents for much longer. They realize that they can separate if they want to, and while they don't look at it as the story of the prodigal son being repeated, they look at it as an opportunity to go and enjoy pleasure. They think like the son when he was leaving and imagine that the outcome won't be the same for them. And they're willing to take a gamble on that. But the point comes when the parents can no longer keep everything looking happy and beautiful. And we notice that one of the kids suddenly disappears from the family pictures. One of the kids is no longer included in the social media posts. And the family that remains, the parents continue to smile for the camera. And they often just allow that one child to disappear. Some of them throw the child out of the house. Some of them tell the child to go away. Note that the father in the parable didn't do that. Some parents get frustrated that one of the children is ruining the pictures, screwing up the social media appearances. And for the sake of those snapshots, they would like for that child to just go away, to get out of the picture. They effectively crop him out. Because they're worried about the snapshots. They're worried that the snapshots make them look bad. And yet, the parable that Jesus teaches us tells us that God doesn't care about the snapshots. God only cares about the end. And He never treats people badly because of negative influence they have on His family photos, on His reputation in the community, on the opinion of others about His work as a father. He never cares about those things. He only cares about His children and the end of the story, the final photo. That's the only photo that matters. And God has many happy final photos. And that's all that matters. And St. Paul tells us that we're to be imitators of God. We're to think and live as God does. We're to value things that God values as far as possible. And so as parents, we've got to be very careful that we don't get wrapped up in this concern for family photos, but that we actually do what is necessary for the final photo for each of our children. The end is all that matters. And in order to actually help our children to have a happy end, this is really important. In order to help each of our children, each of whom is very different, will have different weaknesses, different strengths, different predominant sins, and so on. In order to help each of our children come to a happy end, we've got to do what's best for that happy end and give no attention to present appearances, to reputation, to opinion, and so on. And this is where many parents fail their children. As I said, they get to a point where they wish that the bad kid would just go away. They wish the person with the problems would just go away. Think about the story in the movie It's a Wonderful Life when George is just so overwhelmed with all the stress of his life that he's kind of miserable to be around. And his wife says to him, "Oh, why don't you just..." And everyone knows what she meant to say. And that, for George, is sort of the end. He plans to go, get himself drunk, and jump off a bridge. And it's a fictional story, of course, but we see the pattern of real life in that story. We can never allow ourselves to think selfishly and wish that a bad kid would just go away so that we can have the good opinion of others, so that we can have the good appearances of the family snapshots and just delete the family members who screw them up. We certainly wouldn't want God to delete us from the family photo when we screw up. And He doesn't, thankfully. He loves us. And so there's a danger in parenting where parents focus on short-term appearances rather than long-term realities. Let me say that again because that's important. There's a danger where parents focus on short-term appearances rather than long-term realities. As I said before, some of the most arrogant people in the world are young Christian parents with young children. They've got children, let's say, all under 8 years old, 3 or 4 kids. They've got them all clean, dressed nice. They've got them all sitting nicely at church, hands folded, quiet. They have an appearance of having everything all together, and they say, this ain't so hard. I don't know why all these other families are so screwed up. Look at our kids. We got this all figured out. And of course, they don't have it all figured out because they haven't reached the end yet. They're celebrating their successes before the battle has even started. And as I said before, the difficulty comes with independence. That's where the difficulty comes from. The difficulty comes with puberty. The difficulty comes with the transformation of that little child into a young adult who knows that he or she has the right to do what he or she wants at age 18. That's the challenge. The challenge is not controlling the 7-year-old kid who can easily be punished or put in his bedroom or denied a meal. That's not difficult. What's difficult is maintaining influence in the life of a young adult who's independent and can do whatever he wants. That influence, the ability to pull on the heartstrings, as it were, rather than to physically put a child in a corner, that's the real battle. And when we look at the story of the prodigal son, we see that his father lived in his head. His father lived in his head. Now, no one on the outside would have known that. It certainly didn't look like his father controlled his behavior. It certainly didn't look like his father had good influence on him. But that's because the appearances are misleading. The reality, known to the son, was that his father lived in his head. And Proverbs tells us, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And I always underscore the part that says, when he is old. It doesn't say when he is young, he will not depart from it. It says when he is old, he will not depart from it. And the real measure of good parenting doesn't come when children are 2 and 4 and 8 years old, even though that's important. It comes when you shake that 18-year-old, 20-year-old, 24-year-old kid's hand and say, take care. That influence on the young adult, when he's free, that's when parenting is really put to the test. And what makes that influence possible is much more complicated than what makes that control of the little child possible. What makes that influence possible is real, established character, a real, established relationship, that even if the child despises it in young adulthood, which is understandable and really not a big deal, if that relationship is established, if that character of the father is established in the mind of the child can never escape its influence. And that's what we see in the story of the prodigal son. Even at his worst, he knew his father. He knew his father was good, even when he was at his worst. His father's life, his father's character, his father's teaching, his relationship with his father remained in his head. That's the measure of good parenting. Again, not controlling little kids, but influencing adults. Adults that are entirely free to go and do whatever they please. And it takes real virtue, it takes real love, real patience as a parent to persevere in that work. There can be no limit to the cost and the sacrifice made, and the only parent who will be able to persevere is the parent who constantly thinks of the final picture and is filled with the virtue of hope. That's the only parent who can make it. And many parents I see, especially, as I said, especially parents with young children who think that other parents who have bad experiences are just stupid and don't understand how to control kids. They often make decisions when their kids are young for the sake of maintaining appearances, and by doing so destroy their relationships with their children, show their children a dishonorable character, and lose that influence in their children's lives. I'll give you an example. When parents care more about what outsiders think of them than their actual relation and responsibilities for their children, the children see that. The children see that their parents care more about how things appear to outsiders than how they really are. They see in their parents more concern for outsiders than for insiders. And they see that for their parents, their relationship with outsiders is more important to them than their relationship with their children. And the problem with that is that children, they can find friends, they can find mentors, they can find teachers, but they've only got one shot at parents. And their parents, if their parents are not focused on their children, their parents can effectively abandon them, even though they're together. It's sort of an abandonment of the heart of the parents. And that's where, as I said before, parents can begin to have this attitude where they would like for those children who screw up the family photos to just go away. And if the child would just go away, and the family photos could look good again, and the family could look good again when they show up at church on Sunday, the parents would actually be happy to lose that child. And kids know that. Parents often do that. And those kids experience that. And when those kids leave, they don't come back. Because when they go into the world, they don't have the thoughts of their parents that the prodigal son had of his parents. They remember their parents saying hurtful things. They remember their parents saying, "I wish you would just go away." They remember their parents saying, "I wish you would die. I wish you would leave us alone. I wish you were never born." They hear and remember those words, and when the prodigal son came to his end and said, "I need to go back to my father," these kids say, "No way. My father doesn't want me to come back." And so they either go deeper into their troubles or they kill themselves. And so as Christian parents, we need to ask ourselves, not how do things look in the snapshot when the kids are little, not how do the snapshots look when some of our children are missing from them, but are we parenting our children in a way that gives us reason to hope that the final picture, the only one that matters, is going to be happy? That's what we need to think about. And it's very hard. It's very hard because, again, when you talk to parents of young children, they have their thoughts about how children are to be managed. And if we go to the Catechism and read about the duties of parents and the duties of children, we find that this idea of controlling parents who are going to tell their children what to do, control their choices, control their adult choices, that's actually contrary to Christian teaching. And it's a disrespect to the freedom of the individual, freedom that God gives to all of us. And parents who may maintain an appearance of influence are actually living contrary to Christian teaching. They're not doing the real thing. And they've got to work to kind of maintain this appearance. And it's just a matter of time before that appearance finally falls apart and the truth becomes manifest. And what's worse about that is that the final picture, the one that actually counts, may be miserable. It's very difficult when your kids come to adulthood to respect their freedom, to respect their independence, to grant them independence, and still continue to love them and help them while they exercise this adult independence. It's very difficult, especially when they make bad decisions, when they get themselves into financial troubles, when they screw things up that were handed to them, when they make embarrassing moral decisions, when they choose to follow the world and it becomes visibly manifest that they're doing so. It's very difficult to stay focused on the final family picture and ignore any other snapshots. It's very difficult, but that's the real work of Christian parenting. And what we'll have to deal with along the way, which is a great evil, we'll have to deal with other Christians moved by envy, moved by malice. We'll have to deal with other Christians taking snapshots of our family, as it were, at various points and sharing those snapshots. And I'm talking figuratively, but sometimes this even happens literally. Others meddling in our family affairs, taking snapshots of our family relations, our family circumstances, and sharing them in an attempt to try and bring us dishonor. It's very evil. And again, it provokes us to anger. Anger at the children making that possible. It's a great evil. It's very provocative. And we've got to learn to really despise that shame and know that in accepting that uncomfortable situation, in accepting that dishonor caused by our children or a child, we're imitating God. We're doing to our son or daughter what we hope and pray God will do to us. After all, our salvation is entirely dependent on God's mercy. We're entirely dependent on God sticking with us to the end, though we bring him endless dishonor. And so in those times when we're tempted by the sins of others, and this happens very commonly in Catholic circles, especially where there's this sort of competition among families. And again, it usually comes from younger families trying to raise themselves above older families in a community by making those older families look bad or unfaithful. But true parents have to learn to accept that. And we can learn to bear with that by meditating on the mystery of the crowning with thorns. That's what it's like. We're there in a place of weakness, and our enemies are like the Roman soldiers pressing a crown of thorns into our head, mocking us, spitting on us, wrapping us with a red robe, trying to humiliate us. It's okay. It's okay, because that's what we're supposed to deal with. And it's a part of our love displayed and proven to our children. And our children will see it. Our children will know that we have suffered shame because of them, and we were willing to do so because we love them. And we really don't care what others think or what others say. We care about our children. And we'll do so to the end, because we hope in a happy final picture. And that experience, like I said, we saw it in the life of the prodigal son, that experience where the disobedient child actually sees the father or the mother willingly suffering for his sake. That's where they really become convinced that they're loved. And they're overwhelmed by the reality of that love. And it pulls on their heartstrings, as I said before. It's the invisible influence of love. Real love. That's what ultimately controls independent children. And by God's grace, inspires them to come home, figuratively speaking, knowing that they'll be received and forgiven, because they know, despite all of their failures and sins, they know that their parents have always been loyal to them, always have preferred them over any other relationship. And that's what brings them home in the end, which is all that matters. And so they go through their young adulthood. They test the waters, as it were. They test the world. They mess around and indulge their pleasures. But they quickly learn that God made them for much more. They quickly learn that those pleasures leave them feeling miserable. They feel shallow. They feel empty. They know that there's much more available, but it takes time. It takes time for kids to enter into adulthood, get their own legs underneath them, establish their own adult lives, put the pieces in place one by one. And very often, the kids will feel like religion can be done in the end. Religion can be the last piece put in order. And there's a reason for that. That's not an evil thought. There's a reason for that. They know that religion can be treated like a last priority, because they know that God will receive them. And we can imagine, when we've taught our kids their whole lives that Christ came into the world to save sinners, that God is full of mercy, that God will always forgive them when they turn to Him and confess their sins. We teach them that over and over and over. They go to confession. They see the ease with which the priest absolves their confessed sins. They see that, you know what? Forgiveness is actually kind of easy. That's like the last of my concerns, because I've got all these other things that are uncertain and stressful and so on. It's actually reasonable for kids raised in religious families, in Catholic families. It's reasonable for them to think of religion as something that can be taken care of at any time. I'm not saying it's right, obviously, but I'm saying it's reasonable. And it's true. It's true that if they were to wait until the end and go to God when they finally had things in order, they would be met with mercy. The priest would likely rejoice to see them, and they would have a very warm and gratifying reception back into the church. The kids know that. This is also why they take advantage of their parents. They know when they have loving parents, when they have generous, forgiving, patient parents, even though it's evil, they know that they can mistreat their parents more than they can mistreat their girlfriend or their boyfriend or their boss or a professor. They can mistreat their parents and get away with it because they know their parents are generous and forgiving and patient. And so you can see in that young adult mind where they're scrambling in what I call survival mode to get their lives together as adults, to establish their own path, their own life as an independent man or woman. You can see why they will treat Christian parents or the church as the last concern. Because to a degree, that's really true. That's really true. Again, not that they should think like that, but it's understandable why they would think like that. And when we see them acting like that, I think we have to avoid overreacting. And realize that, yeah, it's common for people to take advantage of Christ because He's just so good. He's so patient with us. He's so merciful. He's not afraid of being dishonored. He'll be there. He will. He'll be there. And that's why He gets mistreated. Because people know that. Gentlemen are always mistreated because they're gentlemen. Women are less likely to talk back to a husband who they know will punch them square in the face. Women will be much more aggressive and disrespectful towards a husband who they know will never hit a woman. A gentleman will always be taken advantage of, and that's part of being a gentleman. And the same is true with parenting and religion. God will always be taken advantage of because He's merciful. And good parents will always be taken advantage of because they're merciful. And we can understand why kids will do that, and we shouldn't overreact when we see them doing that. But if we stay focused on the final picture, if we make patience our superpower and realize that love never fails, but everything else will be proven to be inferior in time. And look at what happens in life normally. How many people are terrible as teenagers or young adults? Terrible, terrible. And then we find those same people in their 30s or 40s, and they're fine. Because that's real life. Think of all the hippies at Woodstock. Back in, the 60s? I don't know if it was the 60s or the 70s. I think it was the 60s. Think of all of those young adults, foolish, immoral, drinking, using drugs, sexually promiscuous, filthy. Where are they now? They're lawyers and doctors and bankers and accountants, housewives. Because the way of sin is not sustainable. There are many mechanisms in place to allow young adults to live foolishly. Student loans, for example. But all that stuff is temporary. It all runs out. You can abuse it for only so long, and then you have to pay your dues. And so we've got to understand how real life works. Think of our own lives. We all likely did similar things to some degree. But that's how life works. And we have to learn not to overreact. But most importantly, when our kids are growing up, especially when they're in the teenage years, young adult years, and this is life or death serious, we have to be really careful that we don't care more about our appearance than we do about the reality of our relationship with our children. Because the only way that we can influence them when they're independent and going through all of their foolishness, the only way we can influence them is by having deep, loving, proven relationships with them. And there's no way to fake that. There's no way to fake it. That respect is earned. That love, that relationship has to be earned. And what we see many Christian parents doing when they're more concerned about their church community than their own kids, when they're more concerned about their Christian friends than their own kids, when they're more concerned about their social media followers than their own kids, when they're concerned more about their co-workers than their own kids, they may have nice pictures on their desk at work or in the house of their little kids. But the relationship that's required to maintain Christian influence in the lives of their independent adult children, those relationships are not being built. And the final picture for them is very unlikely going to be a good one. That's not to say that kids run off the rails because they have bad parents. That would be fatalistic. That's not true. Many kids get away from their families and go on and live happily. Many of them turn back to God later in life, but apart from and almost in spite of their parents. So it's not fatalistic. It's not saying that kids will crash and burn if their parents fail them. It's saying that the parents will lose the opportunity to have the experience of the father in the parable of the prodigal son. And that should be what motivates us to imitate God in parenting and really check ourselves and make sure that we're not content with shallow, selfish, short-sighted appearances, because you can't fake real parenting. I hope that's helpful. God bless.